Thank you, Maria, and good morning, everybody. So my task is to give an overview about National Forest Monitoring Systems and REDD+. REDD+, of course, which was then called REDD at first, without the two Ds and the plus, but it really entered the climate negotiations in 2005. And since the beginning, it's been about national results-based activities. And of course, if something is results-based, you need to monitor it. And hence, in the end, National Forest Monitoring Systems. And as I said, first of all, REDD was only about 1D, just about deforestation. But then we saw a successive broadening in scope with forest degradation, sustainable management of forest and conservation. These other activities started to come in. And interestingly, in view of the sort of orientation of Forest Day 6, we now have discussions of other land use activities, particularly agriculture, that might be linked to REDD in future. So it's been a popular item on the UNFCCC agenda, and the broadening of scope shows the political and environmental interest in REDD. There were two reasons for this, of course. On the part of developing countries, there's the possibility that if REDD becomes linked to compliance or to carbon markets, you might generate much greater flows of finance than is possible through voluntary markets. And for developed countries, the interest in REDD is that in 2005, no developing countries were talking about national commitments. So REDD was the first time that there was the idea of taking national commitments, albeit in one sector, which really broadened the amount of emissions mitigation that might come into a future climate change agreement. And although I understand the progress at REDD here has perhaps not been as fast as some people had hoped, I think REDD remains one of the most advanced sectors in the negotiations. And indeed, it's one of only two sectors mentioned by two mitigation activities mentioned by name in the governing instrument of the Green Climate Fund. It hasn't all been smooth, of course. There have been sometimes recriminations that REDD is only a way for developed countries to avoid taking action themselves. But I think countries who think about it clearly, it's obvious that countries working in good faith towards a future climate change treaty have to see that REDD must be part of that. REDD represents a significant part of global emissions, a significant part of emissions mitigation. So it is most unlikely that you could achieve you can keep temperature increase below 2 degrees centigrade, or even lower than that, if you don't have REDD as part of the deal. But it must, of course, be linked to deeper commitments overall by developed countries if it's to be a success. But if this thing is to work at all, then you need to monitor it. You need to do two things. You need to have a way to measure what the emissions and removals associated with REDD are. And you need to be able to set a reference level consistent with how you make the measurements. And these are two key functions of what's called a National Forest Monitoring System. So in this basic model, a National Forest Monitoring System is the sum of the institutional and consultative arrangements that will enable countries to produce greenhouse gas emissions and to make reference levels consistent with them, and subsequently to monitor how they're making progress in achieving commitments. And we can discuss what the functions of such systems could be. But the functions of national forest monitoring systems may go beyond simply estimating emissions and calculating what reference levels might be. For example, there have been concerns that somehow if REDD leads the commodification of forest carbon, could this undermine the rights and interests of indigenous peoples and local communities? Could a national forest monitoring system help deal with those concerns? Could it deal with concerns about loss of broader forest values such as biodiversity? Could a national forest monitoring system not only monitor emissions and progress towards targets, could it actually increase the chance of success in meeting such targets? Now, so in thinking about those overall questions, there seem to be 5 aspects that might be relevant that we might talk about. The first aspect is, although deforestation is widely associated with capacity gaps in monitoring capability, it's clear that many developing countries do have some forest monitoring capacity, and it's clear that where there is existing capacity, it should be built upon as part of a stepwise approach in establishing a national forest monitoring system. Often these systems were set up for resource assessment rather than measuring deforestation, which means that the sampling strategy which they have may not be ideal for change detection. So they may not be ideal for estimating where deforestation is occurring, and they may need to have additional sampling strategies built into them in order to detect deforestation. However, they can often provide valuable information on carbon densities, which can be help to develop emission factors, which once you have the system capable of detecting deforestation, can be very valuable information. And I think perhaps what we look at is some sort of dual system. I think the idea, the use of images as a resource assessment tool may be helpful in detecting and quantifying degradation. And then we have the additional sampling that we may need to work out where to quantify deforestation itself. And there may, of course, there's this question emerging in the negotiations of the need to quantify conversion of natural forest to plantations, and there may be need to extend existing inventory systems to fulfill that function. The second point is that if REDD is to generate commitments that really are usable, is to generate credits or carbon emission reductions units which really are usable for meeting commitments, we need a consistent system between countries to work out how the quantification is occurring. We need a common standard of estimation. Of course, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, through the development of good practice guidance, has been doing exactly that since 2003 with the good practice guidance for land use change, and since 2006 with the 2006 guidelines. This IPCC guidance, of course, produces emissions estimates which are transparent, consistent and free from intentional bias. It also produces guidance which can tell you what the uncertainty ranges are, and it may be that in the first stages of establishing a national forest monitoring system, we don't have complete coverage of all the carbon pools, but if we have these uncertainty estimates, we may be able to produce estimates which are at least conservative and which allow participation in REDD Plus at an earlier stage and would otherwise be feasible. One thing which may help, of course, in the development of national forest monitoring systems is the combined use of remotely sensed and ground-based data. Now, this remotely sensed data brings in a number of technical complexities, radiometric correction and ortho rectification, all these complex things which have to be tackled to produce self-consistent estimates. But we have the UN REDD and the GFOI, the Global Forest Observations Initiative, which Maria mentions, which are developing methodologies to help with that. The third thing I want to talk about is that national forest monitoring systems should be relevant for national policy development. They're usually thought of as a way to either do resource assessment or to measure emissions and removals relevant to REDD. But if we only think of them in those terms, we're missing a great deal. I mean, if national forest monitoring systems can, for example, be linked to agricultural census data or the development of infrastructure or socio-economic quantities, it's likely that countries can develop deeper policy understanding of what's driving deforestation or forest degradation, and by the same token, what is likely to lead to sustainable management of resources. So we're not just talking about an inventory system here, we're talking about a tool for policy development, and I think that's an extremely, potentially an extremely important characteristic of national forest monitoring systems. And in that way, well, they could do two things. They could help understanding in development and negotiation of reference levels, so of political importance. And once the reference level has been established and the emissions are being measured, they would increase the likelihood of success in meeting targets. Fourthly, I think that the way in which sampling and stratification and in general the national forest monitoring system is set up should be a way to increase stakeholder engagement. This means local communities, and it means private sector entities who might want to engage with REDD. I think if we think about local communities, which of course would include indigenous peoples and local communities, you could have direct engagement in the monitoring process by those communities, and a significant amount has been written about that. And also, so that will be in the actual monitoring process. And the negotiations back as early as Poznan, I think, began to recognise that possibility. And the National Forest Monitoring System may be a way that opinions can be fed back to the government, and also a way for the government to communicate with the stakeholders. So this is taking advantage of the sort of information age, the way in which the ease of electronic communication could be very very helpful in establishing in establishing that aspect of a national forest monitoring system, and it recognises that a national forest monitoring system is not just about statistical sampling and emission factors, it's about different layers of information. Really about better, more transparent, more democratic, perhaps, communication between the government and the people. And we might have information relevant to sort of rights, responsibilities, and safeguards, and such information might also be relevant to how incentives are distributed. I mentioned entity level, meaning private sector engagement, which of course can be controversial. But if we're going to have direct entity level engagement, it's very likely that it will want to be on the local rather than the national scale. So that introduces an interesting relationship between rights and responsibilities at the local scale and rights and responsibilities at the national scale. So that means that the National Forest Monitoring System needs to maintain this sort of local aspect as well as a national aspect. It's a sort of nested concept. Fifthly, and my final aspect that I'm going to talk about, under the Convention on Biological Diversity, countries have agreed to develop biodiversity strategies, and there's this system of targets established at Nagoya in 2010 associated with that. And we have a system of indicative indicators covering biodiversity and social issues advocated by the CBD. Now, close linkage of international conventions and treaties may lead to complexities because of sort of it's generally a bad idea to try to negotiate one issue in two places at the same time. But I think that the development of the National Forest Monitoring System ought to bear in mind what the requirements of the CBD are and what the CBD is asking countries to do, because it will increase efficiency in the use of resources by countries if the same sort of information is needed to be gathered. If information on forest ecosystems is relevant both to carbon and to biodiversity, it makes sense to have the same information system in place to gather the information. I think there's the basic concept of REDD, the historical concept, was quite a simple and an appealing concept. And after 2005, as I pointed out at first, we had gradual broadening of the scope. We've had much more considerations of safeguards, and the text has grown from quite a short 2 or 3 page version to pages and pages of text which have appeared subsequently. And you might think that the sort of broadening of the scope and all these other issues are simply making the REDD, adding burdens to it and making it harder to implement. I don't think that's the way to look at it at all. I think the interest in broader environmental values is simply adding to the interest of REDD. And if these wider environmental values can be captured by the National Forest Monitoring System, that will increase its attractiveness. So the way to look at the broadening of the scope is not negatively as a complexification, it's positively. This shows the interest in REDD, and if we can develop national forest monitoring systems to capture the wider environmental concerns, to increase stakeholder participation, I think we make the chances of success much more likely than they would otherwise have been. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. I think it was very interesting overview, and if I match what Jim has been saying with our experience in the ground, what you could perceive is that the countries themselves are noticing that they have to tailor national forest monitoring systems to their needs, and their needs are sometimes beyond REDD. And therefore, the monitoring system have to fulfill the requirements for REDD, which, okay, you report and all this stuff, but it also could become a real domestic tool for the country to do much more and alleviate also the burden to report to other processes as well. It doesn't make sense to have isolated monitoring systems for different reporting purposes. So it is also a matter of cost efficiency. And I think there has been an obstacle to this way of thinking, which is the fear that you may need to report absolutely everything that you are monitoring in your system. And I don't think this is the case. You have to use your monitoring system for you and report whatever is relevant to the different processes. And said that, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Martin Herold. Please, Martin.
Thank you very much. And my microphone works? Yes. Welcome also from my side. And well, Jim already had a number of very good points that I had also on my list, but there's a few additional ones I'd like to mention. Well, maybe also some of the ones that we can discuss a bit further. One issue is that if you look at national capacities today, we know they're quite variable, and that's not surprising because national forest monitoring in the past happened for a reason, and the reasons were often not carbon-related issues, and so that's why there is one of these gaps that need to be filled. But we see countries we have already done pretty well and have already a lot to build upon. Others have less. And in fact, for the more technical community, for the expert community internationally, these low capacity countries that are also interested to participate in REDD, and the idea is to have an all-in approach eventually. Really, these low capacity countries, that's one of the key focus areas that we have to take on if we want to eventually have a really pan-tropical global system. So that's very important. And that's why this idea of a stepwise approach, or following the phases of REDD+, which maybe have a different length for different countries, is very important. In particular, when it comes to reference levels, because that will be the first number, the first real REDD number that countries will have to submit. In fact, they're already voluntarily asked to do so. And there are important decisions that are associated with that countries were given some flexibility to, as better data become available, to also adjust those in a useful way. So this high variability is important to note. But if you look at countries that have been successful in building capacities in the past before REDD, but also as part of REDD, and we've just summarized some of that in a CIFOR GovSee report that I'm just going to hold up, but you can get it online, and I can maybe provide some more information later, is that there are some real success factors that countries have reported, what actually works, what is really important. And the most important thing that came up is a good institutional arrangements on the national level. Strong political support, strong national leadership, intersectoral coordination. That came up as the most important success factor. And I think that is really a charge for many countries. As forest monitoring becomes a more important issue, as it has been in the past in many countries. So these institutional arrangements, it's one of the key challenges. And having been working with some countries, I can certainly confirm that's one of the key challenges. And it's basically the country. It's basically a national process that needs to ensure that. The other important institutional part is the link to the subnational and to the local level. And that's not all that new if you have countries that have implemented forest policies, like, for example, participatory forest management or some kind of payments and these kind of things. That, if you want a system to work, you have to have a good linkage between the national and the subnational. And REDD is not really different than that. And so this idea of local, subnational, national is, and to me, quite simple, because these levels, also monitoring-wise, they can be quite complementary. There's important data that come from the national level, or important services that the national level can provide to the local level, and vice versa. So there is actually a win-win situation here that one really needs to develop much further, and it's not really an either-or, but it's to advance the monitoring, but also the implementation on all levels in an integrated way. In particular, when it comes to benefit sharing and some of these things, and the link to MRV, that's really something which will become much more important in the future. The second, not the second one, but one of the very other important point that countries have mentioned is this idea of it takes cyclic, continuous improvements over several cycles of forest inventories or these kind of things to actually build up that capacity. Mexico started, I would say, 15 years ago with approach 1, tier 1, and has now arrived at approach 3, tier 2 to 3 kind of approaches. That took 15 years at least of progress. So these capacities can be built, but it is this continuous improvement cyclic process that is pushing that forward. And that is where, in fact, the higher education sector, the stable capacities, the constant engagement with research and development is becoming very important. We know that human capacity is important. We know there are also high fluctuations in government monitoring agencies in terms of technical experts. So these issues of building sustained capacities relies a lot on a strong education, higher education sector also in these countries. I think that's another important point to note. And then the last point I'd like to mention is certainly a bit more on the technical side. It's to provide better guidance to countries. It seems to be that some of these international donor processes are really actively stimulating capacity building in many countries now, while some countries still feel that there could be more guidance. Unfortunately, out of this substar, countries will not be able to get more guidance because there was no consensus on a decision on monitoring and MRV, so the discussions will continue. So there's a few things I'd like to highlight. I mean, one of the areas in particular I have been involved in is what's called the Gold Red Source Book, which has been trying to explain how to use the IPCC good practice guidelines in a national context for REDD+, and particularly highlighting the issue of the use of remote sensing in that, which is a new technical issue that many countries have, and just a new version of that source book. First one was published in Bali a couple of years back, and we have a new version that's now available. You'll find at the entrance, you'll find just a 2-page, or that gives you a bit of an update of the CIFOR report, where you can get that CIFOR report, where you can get that source book and a few other things. If you're interested, please take a look at that. There are, from the remote sensing side, activities. Jim mentioned the Group on Earth Observation, the GEO initiative on global forests, the Global Forest Observation Initiative, which is in fact coordinating space agencies, different ones that have different satellite assets, to try to work with them to provide more coordinated acquisitions for forest monitoring in developing countries. So the international community is really active, or is trying to be active and trying to be helpful to help these national level processes with some things where international coordination, such as those of satellite assets, is actually quite important. And certainly, I mean, the IPCC good practice guidelines are there and they are recommended to be used. But for example, these 5 REDD+ activities, they don't exist really in the language of the current IPCC guidance. So I think there's definitely a need also to look into this and perhaps provide more guidance, because I think country need it to better reflect these new requirements that are being put on the table now as part of REDD+. And that would be my contribution.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for the words. It is quite interesting to see that there are many things going on. There are many people trying to help. And one thing that is also happening, which it has been encouraged by this process, is the fact that the South-South cooperation in technical and methodological issues is also increasing a lot. You have South-South cooperation with Brazil. You have South-South cooperation in between 2 neighbor countries, and I think this is also a very important, evolution out of this REDD+ readiness process on building capacities for national forest monitoring systems. And with this, I give the floor to Juan Carlos for explaining us what is the situation and what Mexico it is working on at the moment.
Is it working? Yeah. Well, thank you, and I'm also trying to go paperless, so bear with me if I push the wrong button. But I guess, well, what I want to do is to just give you a flavor of the thinking that has been going on in Mexico as we go in the development, or I'd say the strengthening of the national forest monitoring system for the purposes of REDD and in its many facets. So having said that, I would at the start agree with what Jim mentioned in that, and also Martin, that national forest monitoring systems, at least in Mexico, is not something new. It's not something we're starting from scratch. And that has some implications, but also some advantages. Martin mentioned 15 years. In the case of Mexico, I was actually going to go to the early attempts to develop national forest inventories in the 60s. Our first attempt took more than a decade to be developed. In the 80s, we had a second attempt that lasted for about half a decade. In the 90s, we managed to have something a bit more efficient. But regrettably, none of those attempts managed to be sustained efforts. It's only been in the last decade or so that we managed to kickstart a new process that has been, at least is proven sustainable up to now. And the challenge, of course, remains on ensuring that the basis to continuing it forward is there. And I'll share a few thoughts with you on that. In parallel, we've been working on activity data. The 5-year land mapping effort that Mexico does. And although that's been sustained in terms of its periodicity, the fact that it addressed over time different objectives and different lenses is also resulted in the fact that those products are not 100% consistent. There's been an evolution. And that hasn't prevented us from evolving or deriving some information from it, but of course it's something also to consider as we move along, and those are important lessons learned that we are trying to accommodate. So having said that, in terms of history, I'd say that there are 4 major drivers of improvement of the NFIs, of the National Forest Monitoring System in Mexico. One of them is legal considerations. The other one is our thinking on national REDD and the or national vision on REDD. A third one that I separate in a way is the international REDD framework that is emerging, and there may be other considerations. But let me start with the legal ones. We've had for a number of years, at least a decade, in law, a mandate to develop an annual study on deforestation. Initially, it was something more ambitious, but we stopped at technical analysis of deforestation done annually. The National Forest Inventory is also something that it was embedded in law as a piece of information that should be there. In more recent times, we are now trying to label it as information for national interest. Information of national interest, which of course, for the layman, just says exactly the same. In terms of government language, that implies some further sustainability in terms of budget allocations for its development. But more importantly, I think in the last 4 or 5 years, we issued our national law on statistical and geographical information, the law regulating our national information systems. And what is interesting coming out of that is the framework or the basic institutional arrangements to sort out not just land-based data, but also other statistical data, economics, social aspects, and so on. And as I would also agree with Jim, the need to combine different elements to have more intelligent decisions has to be there, and having REDD in isolation is not a very useful endeavor. More recently, we've had new things coming up. The new climate change law issued a few months ago and that entered into force less than 2 months ago also has new challenges for the monitoring system. For starters, it has a target of 0 net loss in forest carbon by 2020 in original forests. That, of course, is triggering our entire discussion, which in our national context is original forests. In the language of the REDD safeguards is natural forests. Hence, of course, our reluctance to start getting into a discussion on how do you define internationally natural forests, because already there we think it's something that we need to work on, but it's probably going to be more local based. Policy evaluation, something new in the climate change law, which I think is going to be critical. We need to evaluate climate change policies every 2 years, actually. The registry, and of course, having implications for how the monitoring system will develop a dialogue, how will it inform or relate with the registry. And finally, changes in the forestry law that set a 3-year deadline for the federal government to establish an MRV system for REDD. The date for your calendars is June 6th, 2015. And that, of course, is a useful driver to again, not just keep working and keep improving, but reach at least a version, an initial version of the REDD monitoring system, and the MRV, the R and the V systems as well. On the vision, to move on just from the legal drivers to the vision considerations, I think that what we have tried to do is the biggest challenge and the biggest liability in REDD from our perspective is not on the reporting side, is not on the monitoring side, it's actually on how do you do REDD. How do you actually reduce deforestation and degradation? I keep saying this all the time, but as a bureaucrat, you have to be ready not for success, but to be able to give the difficult explanations. And what I'm trying to say is that you don't want to find yourself in a world where 2 years before the target, you find that through a very efficient monitoring system, you're on the wrong track. You need to be able to understand what is happening, how your policy interventions are working, and even if you had limited data, and even if you don't have the perfect MRV system, if it can assist in making the case of how your national efforts, legitimate efforts are operating, I think we're in a much better shape to move on than just hanging everything on a number and on accounting rules without further information. So even though we wouldn't want to burden the international process with further requirements, we think it's useful that governments think about that as they move forward. So a lot of what we have been doing is thinking on how can we address the complexity of degradation and deforestation processes in Mexico when the basic context is one of highly diverse circumstances, not only biologically, but also socially and economically even. So from a context of locally highly contextualized drivers, what our vision for REDD is right now is one where we want to enable local policies, local responses. Local meaning not just communities, but local meaning also local governments, municipalities, state level, sort of landscape level policy decisions. And what we find is that for now, the division between, the distance between our federal level interventions and policies and the local decisions is simply too big. We need to invest in enabling these other actors at various layers. So a lot of what we're doing has to do with policy coordination, mainly with agriculture at various levels, in empowering local governments and other local structures, local governance structures, including communities, where, of course, by the way, for those who do not know, 70% of the Mexican forest is in private hands, private collective hands. That is either ejidos or communities, but they have full ownership of the forest in their land. Another 15% is other types of forest owners. But anyway, all in all, what we mean when we are talking about governance structures and decision makers, it goes all the way down to forest owners that in many ways, in many cases, are collectivities. So capacity building is also been an important element in our national strategy. And of course, information derived from monitoring systems is going to be key here, and that's being the main focus of our work. The international framework, I think that, yes, I would agree that what we aim, what the REDD discussions on monitoring systems and on MRV is providing us is with useful checklists, useful methods, useful elements for robust, I mean, for sound reporting on carbon results and results of REDD actions. But here, the difficult thing I think is the balancing between how much detail is sufficient, how much prescription is required, and how much flexibility is also needed. So just a word of caution. And then there are other drivers that are emerging. I was recalling when we started our program 10 years ago, Payment for Environmental Services, one of the key challenges was how would we provide credibility to a program that was giving resources in compensation for conservation efforts if we didn't have sufficient data. And the scale of the project was really small, or really large. We were talking about small plots. And we had to develop a parallel system. We had to develop a different monitoring system, high resolution, with quick bird images, iconos images, very expensive system, all for the sake of credibility of the program. As we move forward with multiple interventions associated to REDD, a major driver, of course, is going to be how can we develop that initial credibility, and hopefully we won't have parallel monitoring systems. We don't want a separate monitoring system for REDD. We want that to be blended in our known system. So a word on sort of from all of these, what are the implications for MR of the design of our national forest monitoring system? First, in thinking about enabling smarter policies and interventions, we are definitely thinking on how the monitoring can assist in assessing drivers at relevant scales. Unfortunately, in our case, for our decision, that's leading us into a path of exploring how high-resolution sensors, rapid eye, spots, and others can be of assistance. Secondly, we are rethinking on the protocols for national forest monitoring system, or for national forest inventory data, which is ground-based data, to better assess disturbances in forest. Second element, I think we need the monitoring system to become a policy tool at multiple levels. And that is leading us into the path of how are we going to make monitoring data available. And that's with the masses of information that we're talking about when it comes to remote sense data, that's leading us into the exploration of cloud computing, into how are we going to explore new technologies to disseminate information and make it freely available to relevant users. And of course, in doing so, we are also thinking of the connection with community monitoring efforts that have to be part of the system. Degradation, new themes. I think that degradation is driving a lot of our thinking in the monitoring system ahead, and that's highly connected to the biodiversity commitments. And of course, biodiversity is going to be an element into our design. And of course, in all of these, we need to think about how to contain costs. Two basic things about containing costs in our thinking is that if it was just for carbon, we wouldn't do it. As simple as that. We need to do it for multiple uses, whether it's for our payment for environmental services on hydrological services, whether it is for biodiversity, for local management, or for land planning, or other policy and economic decisions. The use of existing institutions and their own mandate is clear. For instance, for the validation effort, we are not hiring armies of consultants to do the validation. We want to use the experience of the National Statistical Office that has technicians highly experienced, and we need to develop have the ability to contract them internally within government to make sure that they can do this job. And finally, a critical implication is the need for a stepwise approach in all of these. When asked about what is a Mexican monitoring system looking like, let's say for the moment, highly experimental. For the moment, we are experimenting on various platforms. I mentioned rapid eye, yes, but we are also working with spot data. And we're also trying to explore radar data. And we are exploring different protocols at the local level with our national forest inventory. And we are actively trying to find which community protocols are useful. Out of that exploration, then we will decide what makes sense. Then we will assess the capacity building implications to deploy those systems, and then we'll go into full deployment. And guess what? By the time we have full deployment, most likely there will be new technologies, and we will have to do this all over again. So we will, of course, be in a continuous loop. So that's basically what I wanted to share with you, sort of flavor that largely concurs with what Jim and Martin were expressing before. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose Carlos, for this comprehensive exposition of the Mexican efforts. I pass the floor to the autonomy so that he can tell us how Zambia is approaching this.
Thank you very much. I'll try to give the process we are going through. For Zambia, we are in the readiness phase of the REDD program, and we are yet to develop the national strategy. And the process we are going through is part of that process of coming up with a national strategy. And the aim is to have a national strategy that is specific in terms of the actions. And that's the way we have taken things. And we are doing studies, and we are hoping that what we are doing also will be part and parcel of a very specific strategy on REDD. Basically for Zambia, the basic information, 75.3 million hectares, that's the size of the country, and about 50 million hectares of that are forests, and the population is about 13 million. So we seem to be a small number compared to the size of the country. In terms of the process of the forest monitoring system or forest inventories, I think that Zambia has been involved before. The first one was done in 1932, and from that time there have been different forest inventories that have been done. And these forest inventories have been used to plan the use of the forests. In fact, the first management books, as they were called at that time, were done in late 1950s, 1967, somewhere there. These management books were the ones that were used in terms of controlling harvesting and what the communities would collect from the forests and all that. And this concept has basically continued even up to date. Although in terms of management books, I think we haven't produced any since that time. But I must say that in terms of forest inventories, we had the last one in 2005 under the Integrated Land Use Assessment. And then this year, we are having another forest inventories. We are hoping that we can finish by next year. We have 10 provinces in Zambia, and this week I'm very sure they have completed the first province and collecting the data, and we are hoping that that can continue next year, because now the rain season is on and work cannot continue. But that was basically the background to the processes that we've gone through as Zambia. And now, in terms of developing the forest monitoring system, the main question that we've been trying to answer is how can the stakeholders be part and parcel of this process? And how can they be part of the process and be responsible in managing the forest resource? So the approach that we've taken in terms of the National Forest Monitoring System is that, first of all, we are using the existing structures and identifying the current capacity that we have. And that's why even the REDD program is actually being facilitated by the Forestry Department in Zambia. And the development of the MRV system also is being led by the Forestry Department, but of course working with other institutions in the country. And of course the other point is that we have decentralized the system. There are 10 provinces, so we have set up a system that recognizes these 10 provinces, and of course the national system that will provide the guidance and how to proceed on a number of things. Then we have also considered that the system should be very simple for people to appreciate. We feel that we start from a simple thing, and if we have to make it more responsive to current technologies, we will do that. But at the moment, the national level is taking care of that technology issue. But we want to start from as simple as possible and then move from one level to the other, especially for the provincial systems. So in this case, it means we are like stepping up the system, and at the same time, it's very integrated. The Forestry Department is working with the National Remote Sensing Center, and then the Surveyor General's Office, and then Central Statistics. It's a bit of a challenge to try and combine socioeconomic issues with forests and link it to the national reporting itself. But we are hoping that we can achieve this. And Central Statistics has been very helpful in trying to help us do the forest inventories in a manner that might be linked to the Central Statistics Office statistics that they generate. It's a challenge. It's been a challenge. We've had a lot of stakeholder meetings and even the approach itself. But we are hoping that we can get that done in the way we have planned it. So basically the setup as it is at the moment is that the 10 provinces each has a GIS unit, and this GIS unit has, of course, the computers, the map plotters, the GPSs, the software, and all the basic tools that at that level the staff can use. And then at national level, we have, of course, similar equipment, but we expect a bit more of a complex approach at national level, so that the provincial levels can help strengthen the national level reporting. And this reporting is not necessarily for the carbon. We've taken care of what we need as a country, because there's just national reporting on other things. And if we are able to provide accurate information, then that would be very, very helpful for us. So in terms of the whole setup, that's basically the way we have done it, basing on the existing situation, and we are hoping that we will progress very well in that line. We have done some training, and each of the 10 provinces has got a team. It's not from Forestry Department alone, but we have people from agriculture, the regional planning office, and then the civil society, a team of 4 that make up a multi-sectoral team at provincial level. And these have been trained in basic training of GIS and remote sensing, GHG reporting or GHG inventory. But I'm sure we are not there yet. I'm very sure about that. It's a process that we have to continue doing for probably a number of years to be convinced that now the system is working. But at the moment, if you went to each of these provinces, you'll be able to utilize the facilities that are there. So I can say basically we have a system that is working, and now we are still thinking of how best we can link the national level to the provincial level. But it's one way of thinking through how we proceed with our process. So briefly, that's how the system has been designed, and we hope this will be part and parcel of the national strategy to reduce deforestation and then respond to other requirements, other needs of the country. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nami. In the sake of time, I won't reintroduce the questions that were posted for the forum. You have it in the booklet. I think the questions are being answered by the speakers, but of course you can always get more information from them. So I open the floor for questions. We have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. If you can please introduce yourself. There's one gentleman there.
Yeah, my name is Christophe Sagnier from CS in France. I mean, you mentioned the need that the National Forest Monitoring System should be used for other purposes than just REDD. But I was wondering, when a lot of data is being collected in the ground, and the two examples that were discussed, I was wondering whether is it just data about forest monitoring, or could that be also integrated with other use? I mean, in terms of monitoring land use in general.
I think we collect the questions, and then the speakers can, and we will get a round of answers from the speakers. So, second question from this.
Thank you, Chris Meyer from Environmental Defense Fund. Kind of related to the National Forest Monitoring System as requested and developed by Cancun agreements. In the Cancun, it says full and effective participation by indigenous peoples, local communities. Jim, you mentioned the need, and Dr. Penman, excuse me, the need to include indigenous peoples and local communities in this. Martin, you have a report kind of showing what's happening with National Forest Monitoring Systems. Is it starting to be mainstream, the inclusion of indigenous peoples, local communities in National Forest Monitoring Systems? And along those lines, can they accurately collect information? Is it robust, the information they're collecting? And, sorry, one more piece of that. Juan Carlos, you mentioned the need for cost containment. Is this a way for cost containment on these too, to include more local communities and just people in collecting the information?
Thank you. Next question, I think in this side.
My name is Eveline Trines from Scope 14 Plus, and I have a question regarding stratification. If you work in the countries on REDD Plus activities, you work in forest areas with different strata, not only in terms of forest type, but also in terms of carbon density. So one forest type has been managed in the past or mismanaged in the past, different carbon densities there. If you then overlay REDD Plus activities on those grounds, you have an extra layer that you need to stratify. Are you in your design of the National Forest Monitoring System, both in Zambia and in Mexico, taking this into consideration, that the ex-ante and the ex-post stratification, also taking care of the REDD Plus activities? Thank you.
Next question, the gentleman in the front.
Thank you. I'm Alfredo Ghie from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Italy. I just wanted to pick up a couple of key words, speaking about the problem of liaising with other processes like the CBD. Well, CBD currently uses policy indicators, so the monitoring cannot be used for actual implementation. They're the Aichi targets or whatever. So the same parallel, if we want to, and we made the case, we promoted a debate on the issue. The idea, the contention would be, and this would apply to what our Mexican colleague, presenter has said, the problem of having a mass of data to help people taking decisions, how to take relevant data for monitoring. Well, if we continue using data for everything, we shall never go there. We should maybe try to select data contextualized to the local system. And we speak about level, national, regional, or whatever. Even local level is not good. It must be local ecosystem level, the local where the decision has to be applied. Is a local forest, a local whatever fraternity, corporation, whatever. Then you are going to select only those indicators which are relevant to the management of these specific systems. And we have to speak about ecosystem structure and functioning in broad sense, or including economics or whatever, not only biomass or climate or whatever. So if we move, our contention is that if we move in this direction, then a lot of the problems that have been presented could be tackled more effectively. And having said this, we think that the difficulty is the actual interest of those who take a decision that do not necessarily reflect the need to be more comprehensive. Our opening remarks have surely encouraged us to believe this, but this type of reasoning is not necessarily shared by those who have to decide whether this including the plus entails only complication and not also advantages. So it's not really a question, but it's more a kind of request to have reactions on how much you see in your reality, in your institutional reality, the capacity to low down to the ecosystem type of concept and then move it back again to the upper level, to impose tools to help people guiding and on how to identify relevant data and how to make monitoring useful for the taking decision, and therefore how to influence policy by producing good quality management decision. Thank you.
Okay, how many questions we have left? 2? Okay, we'll take the 2, and then we'll have six questions, and then we'll give the floor to the panelists to answer.
More for gold standard. I just have a practical question. How long does it take to do a national inventory? Because later on we want to have the delta between what is today and what is in 5 years. What's the process?
Thanks. Next, the last question. Before.
I'm Makino Yamanoshita from Institute of Global Environmental Strategy from Japan. I have one question about the private sector's involvement to the National Forest Monitoring System. We've been also working for the community participation to the National Forest Monitoring System, and it's been long discussing on this issue, but on the other hand, Dr. Penman already mentioned about the private sector's involvement is also important as for the good governance, but it's a bit difficult for me to imagine how the private sector can involve to the National Forest Monitoring System. So it would be very helpful if the panel provide an example or an idea of the private sector's involvement to the National Forest Monitoring System. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we will start in the order of the presentation. So please, Jim, can you answer those questions that you thought were relevant to you?
Yes, I'll do my best. The first question was about linking wider land use data. I think, could it be linked? I think it's, I mean, all these things, I suppose the answer is that they can be done. The question is how long it takes to do them. I think I said that I felt that the tendency in REDD had been to broaden the coverage, and I think is continuing. And I think these future meetings about being linked to agriculture is part of that. I think there are great advantages to linking wider land use data. Every time you introduce a boundary into an environmental or an economic system, you tend to introduce a perverse incentive somewhere because people will game the boundaries. So I think there are big advantages to doing it. Where statistical systems exist in gathering national agricultural or other statistics, I think they should be linked in, and where they're being developed, I think the linkages to the national forest monitoring system should be part of that. The second question about indigenous peoples and would their monitoring be reliable, and is it possible? I think it's clearly it's indigenous peoples and local communities I was talking about. I think though there are examples discussed in the literature about their involvement, and I think that the book that Martin talked about contains some information on that. I think the reliability of the information depends on whether the people, if we talk about scientific information, I mean actual measurements, the reliability obviously will depend on how the people have been trained in making the measurements in a consistent fashion. But I think that it can be done. I don't think. I think that where it is done, I think that there should be some overlap with the more conventional scientific measurements to make sure they're given the same sort of signal. Is it a way of controlling costs? I think that it should be. I mean, it depends on the relative cost of training and data capture, I suppose. But I think there should be great advantages in terms of engagement. Evelina, stratification. Clearly stratification is. I think stratification is almost the key to everything. I think the combined. I mean, remote sense data on its own cannot provide all the information that we need. I think use of ground-based data to stratify remote sense data could be extremely useful. So I think this is a key area where one ought to combine ground-based data. I mean, knowledge of what the forest ecosystems in the country are and where the intervention is occurring. I think it's likely to be an extremely fertile area of combining both information types. CBD liaison and different indices and context. I don't think. I mean, I'm not sure if I get the question precisely. I don't think we should try to agree internationally every index that countries might seek to report. I think the sort of more overarching the treaty is, or the international agreement is, the more general its provisions ought to be. And then as you get down to it's not possible to negotiate detailed or contextual indices at a high level. I think the important thing is to involve other organizations that do know about the detail and for them to work in this broader context. I think it's important for treaties, people working in different treaties, not to fight with each other. I think they should be good or coordination at the national level to get a consistent message across. And I think it's a good thing if other organizations, some of the organizations we've been talking about, CIFOR certainly, but the CBD type organizations who actually know in detail what is needed ought to do the detailed work within the broad context. How long does it take to do a national forest inventory? I think in developed countries, often, typically they might do a fifth of the forest every year, say. So on that basis, it would take 5 years to do a complete inventory. But I don't think we're only talking about national forest inventories in a classical statistical sampling sense. We're talking about remote sensing data, which obviously can be much more frequent. So I think and that maybe can provide a higher frequency signal. Maybe the national inventory, as I think I've said, might provide what the data to feed into the emission factors is, what the carbon per unit area is, and then using remote sensing, I think you might be able to get to monitor the changes much more frequently. The final question, I don't have in my mind an example for private sector engagement. I did not mean to say that the private sector ought to be engaged in the development of national inventories. I said that if the private sector was engaged in REDD activities, it will probably want to do it at a subnational level, and therefore countries interested in that type of activity should bear that in mind when developing national inventories. That was a need to maintain a sort of sub-national capability. So, I mean, you could say that the private sector entity engagement might become a stratum in Evelina's case, or it might become a project embedded in a broader context. And I think there are other examples in greenhouse gas emission inventories where that type of problem is addressed.
Thank you, Jim. So, Martin, you don't need to answer all the questions, only the ones that you may.
Yes, I will focus. And first, quick remark on what Christoph asked on the broader issues. I mean, it certainly depends a bit on the country situation, but it does make sense if you have a lot of deforestation drivers from the agriculture sector or from the energy sectors of fuelwood and stuff like that, to include that kind of data from the beginning. And oftentimes, these data streams are not coordinated well within the country. So the first task is usually to see and coordinate and then see how the system can be improved together, particularly when it comes to degradation, where actually some of these proxies, fuelwood use or concessions for forestry and these kind of things can really help to be an central part to estimate degradation emissions. Involvement of communities. If you look at the country readiness proposals, almost all countries say they want to do that, monitoring-wise. We heard from Mexico, who's monitoring-wise, I consider it as an advanced country in terms of capacities, is they're just trying it out. I think that was a bit the message we got. And so the next step, I mean, there's no doubt that it can be useful and that it can add, and that on the local level it has been proven. But I think the next thing we need is how can we build integrated systems? And in that sense, from a monitoring point, it's not necessarily much communities or indigenous people, it's how to get the local level. And that may be the private sector, or it may be landowners or other local people involved in REDD+ activities, monitoring, implementation, benefit sharing, and all of that. That all has to be considered in the monitoring system. And so that's, I think, where that main drive comes from. So, but we're starting to see a few examples testing in some countries, but we haven't seen a fully integrated system, I think, yet. But I think many people are working on that, so that's good. And then on how long NFI, just to reiterate a bit what Jim said, I mean, if you track REDD+ activities, you may not have to wait for the next inventory. You can define priority areas of active change or of implementation, and to focus on that, because that's where your carbon measurements need to be most accurate. And so with some smart stratification, or whatever you will call it, I think you can be more effective. Don't need to be until all plots are measured nationally to actually do that.
José Carlos, please.
Thank you. Quickly, on linking to other systems, obviously desirable. I think that we will move faster first on integrating or agreeing on the backbone data and information. So what is common? What are the common inputs? What is a bit more challenging is on other aspects, such as the spatial and temporal coverage of the data that is coming out of different sectors. So that's going to be a need. There's going to be a need for gradual convergence there. On participation, I think that first we see it as a dialogue. We see it more as connecting two different systems. You need local monitoring for local management purposes. You need national systems or regional systems for other purposes. They need to be connected. And I think in doing so, one of our first concerns is how to ensure that local systems are user-driven, so that information coming out of that is meaningful for what they want to do with their land, and not just a reporting requirement for external purposes. For now, I think that we are still in that exploratory mode. There is a specific project that we are working on exploring community forest monitoring approaches. On the cost consideration, I don't know if we will reduce or increase the cost. The main concern is that if there is additional cost with additional value that justifies it, so be it. I think it's, but in general terms, I think it has the potential to reduce cost. On the certification, there are things that we need to look more closely at. We are definitely looking at the two tracks. One is precisely looking at identified data, and how can we stratify in ways that lead to lower uncertainties, just more sound stratification criteria. But on the activity side, there are things that we are also trying to work out. Just to give you an extreme example, the shifting agriculture patterns in the Yucatan Peninsula, we need to typify them as an activity that can be incorporated. It's been always a nightmare of mapping efforts to deal with such complex land management practices. So we are thinking on both without a full solution yet. Yes, on CBD, yeah, we are trying to not to work blindly on specific prescriptive indicators, but trying to make sense of what may be useful locally. To give you an example, at least for national systems, we are about to produce the first version of our social capital index and an economic development index, two things that we will use precisely to track the performance on the backbones of our REDD strategy, which is heavily weighing on strengthening social capital. Our NFI basically takes 5 years to have a full cycle, but because what we do is resample 20% of the permanent plots each year, what that means is that every year you have new data to do comparisons. So it's a question of what sort of what sampling size do you need to have to infer some processes. And on private sector, I agree, there are many ways. It depends what private sector you're talking about. And for us, private sector includes community forest enterprises, small community businesses, investors, as well as even suppliers of services for the monitoring system itself. To give you an example, the NFI data is not gathered by bureaucrats, but we actually contract out companies that do that work for us across the country. But perhaps the most interesting thing we are working on right now is we are working with our national development, with the National Development Bank, to develop a new portfolio of credit products, new credit lines. And in designing those credit lines, one element for discussion is how can monitoring data help them be better target their promotion, track their investments, and not just for carbon purposes, but also for other purposes. So there is a connection there. I think we definitely see the need to have more prominently private sector needs and private sector uses of the monitoring system.
Thank you, José Carlos. Please, Deuteronomy.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll also try just to make comments on the various issues that were raised. In terms of monitoring, land use, of course, for the Zambian forest inventories, it's basically called integrated land use assessment, and we are trying to combine a lot of things, but that will help us maybe determine exactly how we can move in terms of the monitoring system itself. The previous inventory, based on the same methodology, although now we've changed a bit, we tried to combine aspects of agriculture and forests and see how these are related. and now the socio-economic aspects have come in seriously, involving the central statistics to try and combine that. But I think as we move, we may know the best combination on how to do this one. Then in terms of local communities, using local communities, I think also in this case, we need to understand that there are two aspects: the aspect of science and the aspect of real life. And I think even monitoring should take into account. I know now there are methodologies that are being, using GIS. The community can use GIS, but I think sometimes we stretch the community a bit too far. I think they have their own way of monitoring changes and monitoring, and if we can take advantage of that and then combine it with science, we might find some balance of how it should be done. I know somewhere something like this has been done, and I think that's the kind of thing we should go for. We shouldn't really stretch the local communities with science. I think they have their own way of monitoring the forest. They are able to tell you, like, this year we expect a lot of rains, we expect drought this year. And when you ask them what they have seen, they will be able to tell you what they've seen. And I think that's the kind of knowledge we need to explore, but link it to the science that we know. Yeah. Then in terms of stratification, forests, in terms of Zambia, we've stratified the forests, and the forest inventories are based on the forest type. But if you really look at the carbon contents, basically they are also related to forest types in the Zambian context. Zambia is basically in the southern Africa, and our rainfall reduces as you move from the north going southwards. And in terms of biomass, it increases the other way around. It increases as you go to the north. So, in the northern part, we have a specific type of forests, which in terms of carbon content is very high. So the forest types might define a lot of other things, but I think when analyzing it might give us quite some more information. Then in terms of indicators, how we develop indicators, again, it goes back to what I said in science and real life. I think we need to define the simplest way of getting results that easily, or someone can easily understand. Really. Then how long the forest inventory take? For the forest inventories we are doing are basically national inventories, and we expect them to be done within a specific period, but it really depends on how you design it and also how much money you have. It's not a very cheap process, actually. It's an expensive process, and you need to know what detail you need. So if you need a lot of detail, then you need a bit more money to do it, and you may need a bit more time. Like the current one in Zambia that is going on, we have done one province, and the people have been in the field for 2 months now, and they've done one province. There are 5 teams, and there are about, I think, over 400 sample plots. So that gives you, but again, it's after adjusting a lot of things. And yeah. So it depends on the methodology, the amount, the quite detail that will determine. But you can quicken that process if a lot of local people are involved, local people in terms of staff. We are using the district staff in this type of inventory. We have not hired a company to do it. It's the people that live with the forest that are doing it. And then it goes to the private sector involvement. I think the private sector are very good, but they have to see the benefits out of it. Otherwise, they will not be involved. I think private sector is involved only when they are contracted to do something. But I don't think they would do it just for their own purpose or just to help the community. So it's always with some objective of getting something out of it. So the government still leads the process and can work with the variety of stakeholders.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think we're running a bit out of time. So I won't be able to summarize all the rich discussion that we have here, but I want to make a couple points. I think we hear about ownership, we hear about broad scope, we hear about stepwise, we hear about different models can be put together depending on the country. We hear about building upon existing institutions, existing knowledge. We hear about the importance of local versus national linkages, including participation of stakeholders, in particular local communities. We hear about maybe tools for communities to be able to do a good job may need to be developed. In that regard, in the REDD program, which is my task now, there has been some efforts to develop manuals for local communities to be able to do the monitoring, and this is being tested at the local level to see how it works. We also hear about some details, some methodological details on stratification, how stratification can be used to be more cost effective, to be more efficient, to be more accurate. I think all these concepts are floating around and are emerging from experience, and I think this is extremely important. So this is my brief summary, and I just want to finalize saying thank you to the speakers. I have a gift for them. It is not a big gift, but it's a new manual on allometric questions that the FAO is publishing, and they can use themselves in the field and test how allometric questions can be done. There are other efforts to produce such a type of documents, and our colleagues from Japan, they have now produced a cookbook, and we have this Herold source book, and we have the IPCC guidelines, so please use all these tools and work yourself. The manual can be downloaded from the FAO Forest page, so you can also play around with allometric questions in your next weekends. Thank you very much.